My name is Joel. I'm one of the pastors here if I haven't had the chance to meet you. Today we're going to be in Exodus chapter 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. All right, you ready? So if you've got your Bibles, we'll start in Exodus 7, but you can open up to there. And we're continuing a series we started last week called The Way God Rescues, looking at the book of Exodus, looking to see how God rescues his people. And last week, Pastor Will introduced us to Moses, and Moses meeting God kind of face to face through the burning bush, and God giving Moses a task that God was going to use him to rescue his people from Egypt. And God was clear with who he was, that God was the great I am. He was the great rescuer, and that God's plan for Moses was good. It wasn't easy, but it was good. And so Moses now is moving back to Egypt, and that's where we're going to pick up in Exodus chapter 7. If you have the Bible app too, you can find our notes there. If you click on the little 3 lines and go to events, and you'll find Church of Cane notes there too. I want to tell you a story about a little over 10 years ago. I forgot something really important, and I was walking out to go to work that day. Maybe this has happened to you guys before, but we had a lock on our door where you didn't have to have your keys to actually lock the front door. There's just a little twist knob on the back, and so I'm walking out, heading out to work. I've got my bag. I'm ready to go. I twist the little knob thing so that it's locked and walk out, and I shut the door, and I walk straight to my car and then realize I don't have my keys. Not only can I not get in my car, but I also can't get in my house where my keys are locked up. And I was a little frustrated in the moment. It was a busy season for me. I had a lot of things going on, and that busyness had kind of led to a little bit of a disconnection between God and I wasn't spending time with him like I should be. I got caught up in the busyness of work that sometimes comes in ministry. And I feel like in that moment, I hadn't just forgotten my keys, but I had forgotten how much I needed God. And that day, God wanted to remind me of how much I needed him. And so I spent the day on my back porch, reconnecting with God, and God just reminded me of how desperately I need him. I need him to be my rescuer. I need him to be my savior. Sometimes we forget things. And the people of God in Egypt, as they were caught in slavery, God knew he needed to remind them of some things. They needed to remember exactly who he was. And so today we're going to be digging into this in a way. We're going to walk through these 7 chapters. And I want to just go ahead and tell you, there are some things today in this passage that are hard and that are difficult. They're hard for us to work through and process and realize and understand even about God. But I think that that's a good challenge for us to be able to walk through together, to get a picture of who God is in a real and in a clear way. So we're going to jump straight in, if you're ready, in Exodus 7, and we're going to start reading in verse 1. So Exodus 7, verse 1. It says, "And the Lord said to Moses, 'See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart. And though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my hosts, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them.' Moses and Aaron did so. They did just as the Lord commanded them. Now Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh." So as we dig into this passage, there's a few things I want us to remember here. And in the beginning, it's interesting that God says to Moses, "I'm going to make you like God to Pharaoh." Now, God's not saying that I want you to be God in this situation. What he's saying is Pharaoh had this tendency to see himself as God. He is the most powerful person in the world. He's the one that could do whatever he wanted to do. And God wanted to stand in front of Pharaoh and prove that Pharaoh is not God, but that he was God. And God is going to use Moses to make that happen in this moment. And so we see this happening, that Moses and Aaron are going to go to Pharaoh, and they're going to speak the things that God tells them to say. God's going to do signs and wonders, but Pharaoh is not going to listen in this moment. But God, in this moment, is going to show his power. And that's the first thing that really we need to remember as we look at this morning, is one, we need to remember the power of the Lord. Remember the power of the Lord. That last verse, Moses was 80 years old. Aaron was 83 years old. And that should be a good reminder to us that we're never too old for God to use us. We're never too young for God to use us. Wherever we are in life, if we're walking with God and listening to God, God is going to use us wherever we are in a significant way for his kingdom. And that's what he does through Moses and Aaron here. Even though Moses doesn't feel capable, doesn't feel like he can do this work that God has laid out. He had lots of excuses for God before, and he says, I don't have eloquent speech. I can't convince Pharaoh. I can't do all these things. But Moses isn't the one that was going to be doing the work. God was. God is the rescuer. God is the one with the power. And so we're not going to go through all 7 chapters word for word. I know you're disappointed in that this morning. But I will encourage you that if you want to take some time and read through Exodus 7 through 13, that's probably a great thing to do on this holiday weekend to get kind of a full context of the story. But I want to kind of catch you up on the story as it progresses. And so Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh, and they do what God asked them to do. Because God's people had not been able to worship the Lord like they were supposed to. There were laws in Egypt that kept them from doing some of the things that they would normally do to worship God. And so to do the kinds of things they needed to do, make sacrifices, they were actually going to have to leave Egypt to do those things. And so Moses and Aaron come to Pharaoh and they say, hey, can we leave for a little while, go out into the wilderness, worship God? Will you let us do that? And Pharaoh in this moment says, well, maybe, but I want you to prove yourself. Where's the power? Why should I listen to you in this moment? And so Aaron has a staff, and right here in front of Pharaoh in this moment, Aaron does this thing where he throws his staff down and it turns into a serpent. Some of you were expecting a snake. But he does this. He throws it down, and it turns into a serpent in this moment. And Pharaoh is like, okay, well, you know what? I've got some guys too. And so he brings out these magicians, and they throw their staffs down, and they turn into serpents. And so Pharaoh's like, why should I listen to you? I am just as powerful as your God. And so in this moment, God is going to prove his power. And so God brings a series of plagues on the people of Egypt to show that he is indeed powerful. Now, the first plague that comes is a plague of blood. So Moses and Aaron take their staves and they strike the Nile River, and all of the water in the Nile River turns into blood. There's no drinking water anymore. This is where the people of Egypt bathe. There's no place for them to do that anymore. Pharaoh brings his magicians out, and he's like, guys, can you do this? And they do the same thing, and they're able to achieve the same things. Pharaoh's like, I'm not impressed. God brings a plague of frogs on the land, and so there are frogs everywhere. Just frogs and frogs and frogs. More frogs than you've ever seen. Pharaoh says, hey guys, can you make frogs? They come out, and they make even more frogs. I don't know why Pharaoh wanted more frogs, but he got more frogs. And so there are frogs that are everywhere. But at this point, Pharaoh's like, this is too many frogs. And he's like, Moses, can you go and ask your God to get rid of the frogs? And so Moses does, and God gets rid of the frogs. The third plague is a plague of gnats. And this is where things begin to change, because there are gnats everywhere. And God does this thing. Pharaoh calls his magicians in, and all of a sudden, they're not able to replicate it anymore. God is proving himself to be powerful. Then we have flies. There are flies everywhere in the fourth. The fifth is that all of the livestock in the land of Egypt, or a lot of the livestock, is killed. It all dies, except for the livestock that the people of Israel have. The sixth plague is boils and sores that they get all over their body. All the people of Egypt are covered in sores and boils, except for the people of Israel that are in Egypt. The seventh plague is a plague of hail, where hail is coming down and it's destroying crops and anything that's left alive. The eighth plague is a plague of locusts, eating anything that is left, swarming inside of houses. And the ninth plague is a plague of darkness, where for 3 days it is completely dark in the land of Egypt. And all of these things, God showing his power, Pharaoh says, you know what? I want to be bigger. I want to be stronger. I am not going to let God's people go. But you know what Moses and Aaron, he tells them, he says, I want you to get out of here. I never want to see you again. Don't ever come back. If you come back, I will kill you. And so Moses and Aaron leave in this moment. But through these plagues, God shows his power. He shows that he is God. There is no other God. He alone is the God with power. Why would God do this through these plagues? I think there's a few reasons that we can see through this. The first reason is this. God shows his power for his glory. God shows his power for his glory. Now, Egypt and Israel are able to see through this and know that God alone is God. That there's no one else that can rescue his people. There's no one else who can steal his glory in this moment. It is just him. And these plagues aren't just about punishing Egypt. They're not just about rescuing his people. God is showing himself to be powerful and to prove that he's God. Look at verse 5 that we read in chapter 7. Again, it says, the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them. God's goal here isn't just rescuing his people. It's not just stretching out his hand in judgment against Egypt. The goal is that the people of Egypt will know that he is the Lord when he does those things. God's glory matters to him in a big way. God wants to prove that he alone is God. And his people needed to remember that he's the only one who could rescue him. And sometimes we, I think, need to remember how important and powerful and glorious God is. Because sometimes we can be glory thieves. We can try and take credit for things that only God can do. We can lift ourselves up on a platform and put ourselves in a place where only God should be. But it's only God who's worthy of all that glory. So God shows his power for his glory, but number two, he also shows his power for our good. Now, this is really easy to see in the people of Israel, right? God is rescuing his people out of slavery, and so for them, it's a very good thing. But I would say to you as well this morning, it's also good for the people of Egypt that all of these plagues happen and that God shows his power. You may ask, how could that be good for the people of Egypt? How could it be good for them to suffer and struggle and walk through great difficulty in this moment? Well, see, God is warning them that they are following after a false God, and he's trying to get their attention in this moment. And I think it's so important for us to know that if these people of Egypt really were following after a false god, if they really were being led to a path of destruction, then God is completely right and completely justified to go to whatever lengths he needs to go to get their attention to prove that he is God and not Pharaoh, and that they needed to trust him instead of Pharaoh. What about us? Gosh, sometimes I think we go through hard things and struggles and difficulty, and I think it's God trying to get our attention. Because we've been putting our eyes on other things. We've been trusting in other things. We've been trusting in ourselves when we can only get what we need from God. Jonah, God sent a fish to swallow him up to get his attention. God blinded Saul on the road to Damascus so that he could remind him that he alone is God. What is God doing to get your attention? And are you listening? Are you paying attention? So God shows his power for his glory, for our good, and then number three, for his justice. I want to go back to Exodus 6. Look at verse 5. Look at what God says. He says this, "Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the people of Israel, whom the Egyptians hold as slaves, and I have remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment." You see, God is moved to compassion for his people. His people had been enslaved for 430 years in Egypt, unable to worship him the way that he desired to be worshiped. And not only that, but the Pharaoh was so afraid of having this whole nation of people in his nation. He was so scared that there could be an uprising that he made a decree that every male child born of the people of Israel would be thrown into the Nile River and put to death, so that there wouldn't be any men, so that there could never be an uprising up against him, because Pharaoh was trying to hold on to his power. And God sees all this, and he sees the groaning of his people, and he says, you know what? I am a just God, and I will have justice for my people. It's crazy that Moses himself is an example of this. If you go back to Exodus 2, Moses is born in this time, a Hebrew, and he's a baby who should have been killed, but his mom puts him in a basket and floats him down the river to where the daughter of Pharaoh sees him and finds him and raises him as her own so that he can have life even amongst this death sentence. God saved Moses in a lot of ways for this very moment where God can prove that he is just and that he will punish evil. But then we face what's probably the most difficult plague of all, in the 10th plague. If you go to Exodus chapter 12, skip ahead, we can read in verse 29 what happens. It says this, "At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. And then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, Up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also." That night, God killed the firstborn of Egypt. Why? I've wrestled with this and lots of other passages. I've wrestled through these things with God many times, and we wonder, was it necessary for God to kill the firstborn? Why did this have to happen? Some things, I think when we read the Bible, we have limited minds and limited understanding. 1 Corinthians 13 tells us that now we see in a mirror dimly, but one day we will see God face to face. One day we'll understand these things. But still, I think there are a few things that we do know, I think, that are important for us to remember. One, we've got to remember that God is just. Pharaoh had enslaved his people for over 400 years. And the people of Israel, every son had been killed and slaughtered, not just the firstborn. God had every right to prove his justice towards Egypt. Number two, God gave many opportunities for Pharaoh to change his mind. He could have done it in the first warning, when Moses and Aaron just came and asked him, hey, can we please go worship? And they threw down the staff. He could have done it after the first plague of blood, but for whatever reason, Pharaoh wanted to prove that he was the powerful one. And so in stubbornness, he just kept going and kept going. Now, I don't want to ignore the fact that the text talks about God hardening the heart of Pharaoh. And it might cause us to question, did Pharaoh really have an opportunity to let God's people go? Here's what I do know. Even in this last plague, the final 10th plague, Pharaoh's heart was still hardened in that moment, and yet he let God's people go. So I believe that he had opportunities. He had opportunities to let God's people go. Here's another one. Number 3, God relents. In many of these plagues, Pharaoh asks Moses and Aaron to plead with God. Things are too bad. Can you please go ask God to stop doing what he is doing? And so Moses and Aaron go to God and they plead with God, and God relents. He ends the plague. And in those moments, instead of Pharaoh saying, I'm so thankful that your God did this, I'm going to let your people go now, he realizes, hey, this plague is over. I'm going to keep your people in slavery. And he keeps going. But God, when Pharaoh is pleading with him, God listens. But Pharaoh wants to hang on to his power. And then number 4, and probably most important, is we have to know that there is a cost to redemption. There is a cost to redemption. Any time God redeems, there's a cost. In the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, when they first realized their sin, God killed animals so that they could cover their nakedness in the skins of those animals. The Old Testament sacrificial system tells us that there has to be a death of an animal, a sacrifice for the forgiveness of sin. Hebrews 9:22 points to this. It says, indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Anytime God redeems something, there is a cost. For someone to be saved, something has to be sacrificed. And that leads us to kind of our second big point. Not only do we need to remember the power of the Lord, but number 2, we need to remember the salvation of the Lord. Look back a little earlier in Exodus chapter 12, starting in verse 3. God says this, tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household's too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons. According to what each can eat, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire. With unleavened bread and bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted, its head with its legs and its inner parts. And you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. This blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you, and I will strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be for you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. As a statute forever, you shall keep it as a feast. You see, that night when God brought judgment to the people of Egypt, God brought salvation to his people, Israel. And yes, there was a great cost for Egypt. It cost them their firstborn. For Israel, it cost them their perfect lambs. But God saved his people. Pharaoh relented, and he released them to go and worship him. And it's a moment that the Jewish people have celebrated ever since then, called the Feast of the Passover. Every year, they do this to remember how God saved them, how God is the great rescuer who brought them out of slavery in Egypt. This moment where they're saved from the wrath of God by putting the blood of a perfect lamb on the door. And we may ask the question, why do there have to be plagues? What was it necessary for the Passover to happen? And it's because God wanted his people to remember who he was. I want to paint a picture for you. It's a picture that God's been painting from the beginning of time, that this moment in history is so important, even way beyond the moment that it was for the people of Israel and their salvation from Egypt. But God is using it to point to something that's so much bigger and so much deeper and so much greater, in proving that he is the God who saves, not just Israel, but us as well. You see, the people of Israel were instructed to find a perfect lamb, and they were to slaughter that lamb and take the blood of that lamb and put it on the doorpost, saving them from God's wrath as he passed over. But all of that was pointing to the fact that one day there would be a perfect, sinless lamb that would be sacrificed and killed on a cross, whose blood could then be applied to our hearts so that we could be saved from the judgment of God against our sin. And when God killed the firstborn of Egypt, there was a great cost to the people of Egypt. But all of that was to reveal that one day his son, the firstborn of all creation, would die so that we could be redeemed, we could be made new at great cost to God. This moment of Passover is this beautiful moment in history when the wrath of God against sin and the grace of God meet in a beautiful way where we can see clearly who God is. That he is a God who is both loving and gracious, but he's also a God who is just, who cares about sin, who cares about evil, and he will have his justice. And there's one other moment in history that happened that points to this, that shows us this clearer than ever before. And it's this moment where my sin and your sin caused Jesus to end up on a cross, where the wrath of God had to be poured out upon our sin. But Jesus stood there in our place in the love of God and took that punishment for us. And there is a Friday to come, some 1,500 years after this very first Passover, as the people of God are preparing for the Passover, as the people of God have these perfect lambs that they've selected, and they take them and kill them at that very same moment on a Passover day, 1,500 years later, God's firstborn perfect lamb was sacrificed on a cross on a hill for you and me. And there was never a need for another lamb to die. There's never a need for another firstborn to be killed. Jesus' death on the cross was enough. Maybe you're here this morning and you just need to be reminded of that. You need to be reminded of who God is. Maybe you've never seen God's love in such a full, big way before. Maybe you've never experienced God's love and you want to come and meet him and know him. I want to tell you, this God of love and justice, he sees your sin and he knows that it's real. But listen, he already sent his son Jesus to die so that you could be redeemed, so that you could be made new. And you can come and meet him and enter into a relationship with him today. He loves you more than you can imagine. And no matter how great your sin is, the death of his son is far greater and covers it. Some of us just need to remember. Remember that God is a God of power and a God of salvation. And we need to stop treating him like he is small. He's the great I am. He is the great rescuer. When we were lost and hopeless and dead in our sin, he sent his son Jesus to come and find us and bring us back. I think so often our understanding of God's love comes from quotes we see on social media, but God's love is so much bigger than that. Guys, we can't even begin to understand the depth of God's love unless we understand how much God cares about justice towards sin. John Piper says it this way in his book, Desiring God. He says, the good news is that God himself has decreed a way to satisfy the demands of his justice without condemning the whole human race. Now, hell is one way to settle accounts with sinners and uphold his justice. But there's another way. See, the wisdom of God has ordained a way for the love of God to deliver us from the wrath of God without compromising the justice of God. And what is this wisdom? The death of the Son of God for sinners. God cared so much about justice towards your sin and my sin that he couldn't just let it be, but it had to be dealt with. And so instead of us being punished like we deserved, his love drove him to see that his justice was still met, even at the cost of his own son. And Jesus in great love died for us. We make God's love small when we imagine that there could be forgiveness with no thought of justice. But what makes God's love so big is that it's a place where perfect justice and perfect love meets. And some of us this morning just need to confess to God that we've been thinking of him in small ways. That we've been imagining him as some fairy tale who just loves us and forgives us at no thought. That there's no cost to him to do it. He's just magic and he can do whatever he wants. But there was great cost to God in forgiving you and forgiving me. And we need to remember that the power of God drives towards his love for us. So I want to invite you this morning. We're going to pray. We're going to confess to him. Some of us need to confess that we need to meet him for the first time. I'm going to be down here praying, and I invite you, come and find me, someone else on our team, someone that you know, talk to them, pray with them. Let them know, I want to meet this God who loves me so much. Guys, but for a lot of us, we just need to confess that we've been looking at God in small ways. That we've been imagining that my forgiveness wasn't that big of a deal. It cost him the life of his son. God is the great rescuer. And he's the great rescuer because he loves us so much. So I'm going to invite you to stand up. We're going to sing in just a second. But as we move and transition into this time of worship, if you just need to confess some things before the Lord, you can kneel where you are. You can come and join me down here at this altar and confess to God, God, I want to see you for who you are. Not for a God of my imagination, but for the God who loved me so much that, yes, he needed to see my sins punished, but he did it at the cost of his own son. We need to confess to the Lord that we want to see him in real big ways. So I want to invite you. We're going to sing, we can pray, you can kneel, or you can come now and join me right here. And let's have a time where we talk to God about who he is and how we need to see and understand him. You can move if you want to join me.